like to continue the discussion about broad macroeconomic approaches in this video. In a previous video, we had talked about the broad macroeconomic goals of trying to have high employment, high economic growth, and contained inflation, and that there are different approaches that are sometimes proposed to deal with these issues. Now, I want to reemphasize one thing I mentioned before, that there's really, I would say, a consensus among mainstream economists that if you have flexible prices and flexible wages, that you will stay very close to full employment, and that any problems with a recession will be self-regulating. But Keynesians will focus on sticky wages and prices, especially in the short run, and say, well, if you got this, you're not going to be able to have this self-regulation of business cycles and employment problems. Neoclassical economists, macroeconomists, would tend to focus on the flexibility of prices, especially in the long run, to deal with these problems without government aggregate demand policy, government stimulus policies, if you will. Now, I want to talk about this before in sort of general sense. I want to bring this into aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis that you've probably seen in an introductory macroeconomics course. Again, aggregate demand is basically a depiction of consumer demand for goods and services, demand for investment goods, government demand for goods and services, exports, and then subtracting imports so that you don't double count the imports in in these other variables. So we've mapped aggregate demand as this downward sloping curve with GDP on this axis and the overall price level, P, on this axis. And what I'd like to do now is to give what is really properly thought of as a caricature of both the Keynesian and neoclassical models. And I want to emphasize that because I'm really making this simple for illustrative purposes. In particular, a Keynesian, an easy way to analyze this is not only to assume that wages and prices are sticky, but let's assume that wages and prices are fixed. Now, if that's the case, the aggregate supply curve should be thought of as being horizontal. Prices are fixed, and the amount that's supplied into the market is not a function of price. Okay, you'll have as much supply as there is demand given a particular price level. Now, in this view of the world, if GDP, or let's call it Y, is here, but the full employment level of output is higher, okay, so you've got less output than full employment, you'll have unemployment, then what a Keynesian will do is that you need to do something to increase aggregate demand in order to get up to the full employment level, because the idea is that the economy can come to rest at a level of output that is below the full employment level of output. And there's no way to really get it out of that without something to increase aggregate demand. Now, the standard set of aggregate demand policies, let me write this over here. So when we talk about aggregate demand policies, these are various things that will result in a stimulus on the domestic economy. There are really three important ones. One would be a reduction in taxes. Another one would be an increase in government spending. And the other would be an increase in the money supply. Now, this you should all be familiar with from an introductory macroeconomics course. But all three of these things, a tax cut, an increase in government spending, an increase in the money supply, will result in a shift out in the aggregate demand curve and potentially get you back up to the full employment level of output. Now, there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind this that you would have seen in a macroeconomics course, but that's the basic idea. Now, so far, this is strictly in the context of a closed domestic economy. Okay? This effective increase in aggregate demand in the Keynesian world is really for a closed domestic economy. When we talk about an open economy, we're going to see that these are not always effective. Okay? But the bottom line here is that the Keynesian viewed these policies, some sort of aggregate demand policy, as a way to get you out of a recessionary position. Now, the caricature, again, I want to underline caricature, of the neoclassical approach is that you've got aggregate demand associated with price level and overall level of GDP. And the way a neoclassical economist would think about the aggregate supply curve in the long run is that it's fixed in the following sense. The neoclassical view is that output is a function of the capital stock, the amount of machinery, the buildings, the human capital, the capital in the economy, and the labor force, and the technological capabilities of the economy. And so your aggregate supply, what you can produce, is going to be fixed, a vertical aggregate supply curve. And in this view of aggregate demand, the neoclassical type would think, if you increase aggregate demand by one of these policies, what you're going to get is not a permanent increase in output beyond that fixed level, but instead an increase in prices. So these are two polar opposite ways to think about the function of aggregate demand and supply, whether you are a Keynesian or a neoclassical type. Again, with these caricatures of aggregate supply. Now, and I'm actually going to use these caricatures, if you will, for the course to help illustrate these ideas. But one way to really think about this as a more intermediate view of things rather than these two caricatures is that we've got price level and output, we've got aggregate demand. A lot of people will have a view of aggregate supply not as a horizontal line or vertical line, but instead that aggregate supply is upward sloping until you get to the full level of output, in which case increase in demand beyond that will simply result in higher prices. And that if you have very low levels of output, or a big recession, then aggregate demand policies will have very little impact on prices. Instead, get an increase in output in the short run. Now again, I'm going to use these two polar opposites in these lectures to give sort of a stark comparison of these. But this broad neoclassical and Keynesian view of things really underlies a lot of policy discussions about what the approach should be to solving macroeconomic issues. In the United States, a lot of Democrats are associated with a more Keynesian type approach where the focus is on let's use government spending, let's increase the money supply in order to get aggregate demand up to get rid of inflation or unemployment and boost the economy. Many Republicans are associated with a more neoclassical approach to say, look, you can do this, you may get a short-term burst of economic activity, but you'll have inflationary pressures. And instead to focus on underlying policies that affect the capital stock, the productivity of labor, and so forth. So these are, bandied about in policy discussions in the real world. Again, none of this that we've talked about is really in the context of international economic policy. As I've alluded to before, what we're going to find within an open economy is that some aggregate demand policies will be ineffective under certain types of exchange rate regimes and in different contexts of the open economy. Okay, again, so another overview of macroeconomic policies, put some of the future discussion in context.